Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. This is the third episode of Season 1, where I will be narrating for you the young adult romance Blemished Beauty by Brenda Hodnett, which, by the way, you can buy the printed copy of on Amazon. This is Chapter 3. Here we go. Chapter 3. Checkmate. Daphne knew she was asleep, but she still couldn't stop the dream. She was skiing down a snowy mountain at a rapid pace. Her skill didn't escape her now. She glided through trees and under branches. As she caught sight of her boots, she realized she was wearing downhill ski boots instead of cross-country skis. She glanced up to see a long, steep stretch of moguls. She skied in and out of them with no trouble at all, spraying mists of snowy powder behind her. The sun was shining brightly, and she smiled, basking in the warmth of it. Then she sensed someone coming up behind her. It was danger, she knew it. She forced herself to ski faster and faster. Then she spotted Laurel at the bottom of the hill. 3 men surrounded her, and they all had their undivided attention on her. Laurel smiled and laughed and touched every one of their arms. Then Daphne heard someone behind her.
"Where are you headed, Daphne?"
came the rough voice of a man. He was so close she could feel the sprays from his skis. "I'm going to catch Laurel," she cried into the wind.
"You'll never catch up with Laurel," the voice leered. "This hill never ends."
"I will catch up with her," Daphne insisted. But the man was right. The harder she tried to reach the bottom of the hill, the longer and longer it seemed to stretch. Daphne smacked her lips in frustration and moved her legs harder and faster.
"What are you running from, Daphne?" the man mocked again.
"I'm running from you," she yelled.
"No, you're not running from me. You're running from yourself."
And then the scene changed, and she was suddenly on the edge of a pool, ready to dive into a butterfly stroke. Laurel was standing beside her, ready to do the same. They were wearing matching purple racing suits, just like they always had as children. Their features had also been so similar back then, everyone called them the twin goddesses. But standing next to Laurel now, Daphne knew they looked nothing like twins. Although they were both thin, Laurel seemed to be stronger and more mature. Even though their hair was about the same color, Daphne couldn't help but notice how the blonde streaks in Laurel's hair glistened with every turn of her head. The most excruciating difference between them was Laurel's smooth, tan complexion. Instinctively, Daphne touched her cheeks, only to feel her red, bumpy sores. To her great horror, she saw them spread rapidly down her neck, arms, legs, and even her feet. Daphne gasped as she stared at her infected toes. Just then a whistle blew, and Laurel did a perfect dive into the water. Daphne dove in a second later and was determined to catch up. Adrenaline pumped through her veins as she swam as hard and as fast as she ever had. But Laurel still won the race. Breathing hard, Daphne walked towards her locker room, but instead found herself in a recital hall. Laurel was standing on the stage, dressed in an elegant red gown with her viola in hand. She was performing a magnificent piece with a beautiful vibrato and lovely smooth bowing. People were walking past Daphne, who for some reason was still drenched and dripping. They gave her disdainful sideways glances before they turned towards Laurel and cheered. When Laurel finished performing, Daphne scampered up to meet her, but 3 guys beat her to it. "Look, boys," Laurel cried, pulling out a piece of paper from her breast pocket. "I'm an honor student." "Oh, wow! Ooh!" The boys ogled Laurel and admired her paper. "I'm an honor student, too," Daphne announced, but no one turned around to acknowledge her. "Hey! I'm an honor student, too!" Daphne woke, startled, gasping for air. She found herself lying on her back on top of the rosy bed. Although she had never actually gotten into the bed, she discovered 2 extra blankets were spread out on top of her. Even in the darkness, she knew it was morning. She inhaled deeply. Just a dream. Although Daphne hated to admit it to herself, that dream was fairly indicative of her life. She would never catch up to Laurel. There was a soft knock on the door. Daphne saw the brass doorknob turn slowly, and Tom peeked in. Oh, good. You're awake now. Do you feel any better? He switched on a tall lamp close to him. Daphne stretched her arms and legs. Her calf didn't have the same piercing pain as before, but it certainly had not healed. Yes, I feel better. Thank you. I brought you some crutches in case you need them, Tom said, motioning to the right side of Daphne's bed. Daphne turned her head slightly to see some tall crutches padded with some kind of tan foam leaning against a tall, shiny oak dresser. Oh, yes, that will be very helpful. She sat up a bit as she spotted her clothes, dry and folded on top of the dresser. Did you wash my clothes? Daphne asked, surprised. Oh, yeah. I figured you might want some clothes that fit you, Tom explained with a small smile. Wow, that's very nice, Daphne muttered, blushing again at the sight of his gorgeous self. You didn't have to do that. Tom shrugged. No big deal. Daphne glanced at Tom's face in the brightly lit room. He was looking at her, too, and she noticed he didn't even look up horrid to see her, nor did he appear surprised. Why are you so nice to me? Daphne wondered out loud. Tom raised his red eyebrows and then smiled a little shyly. Well, first of all, you need the help right now. And second of all, it's nice to have something else to do besides the same old stuff, you know? Daphne sat up and nodded. I can understand that, but I'm not accustomed to people doing things for me. I bet you're also not accustomed to getting lost in a blizzard either, are you? Tom said with a warm smile. Daphne smiled back. That is definitely true. Tom was still grinning as he left the room. Now she had her mind made up. If he could look at her without reproach, then she wouldn't shy away either. She would feign confidence. She would make sure to look him in the eye. After all, in a couple of days, she would never see him again anyway. There we go, thought Tom as he scooped a hot waffle out of the waffle iron. I finally got her to smile a genuine smile. Tom piled the waffles on top of each other and poured some of his homemade cinnamon syrup into a small glass pitcher. He was placing some thawed strawberries on a plate when he heard the loud clunking of crutches coming down the hallway. He turned around to see Daphne smiling wide at him. Tom smiled back, mostly because of how much her smile, as well as her wearing her own clothes, improved her looks. Want some breakfast? He offered. I would love some. It smells wonderful. The two of them sat at the tall breakfast bar and began to dig into their food. Is this made from scratch? Asked Daphne with admiration in her voice. It is. Do you like it? Mm-hmm, she murmured, her mouth still full. She chewed some more and then swallowed. It's amazing. Tom smiled at that. Thanks. It's nice to have someone appreciate my cooking. He thought of the last meal he had cooked for Tanya, his ex-fiancée. He had spent hours cooking a delicious crab rangoon. She had taken one look at it, turned up her nose, and said, Yuck, get me some fries. Well, it's certainly better than anything I've had lately. I usually eat cold cereal or pry open a can of soup for my meals, Daphne noted. Then suddenly she turned towards Tom with a big grin. Speaking of which, the soup you made last night was delicious, she exclaimed. Tom let out a brief laugh. It's good to see you take pleasure in the small things. Well, how else are you going to enjoy life, you know? Daphne paused, taking another bite. Tom nodded, chewing his waffle. She is kind of insightful. So neither of your parents cook, huh? Tom asked. Daphne looked at him with surprise. Oh, I don't live at home. I live in the dorms at Brocksville University. And actually, my parents are in Afghanistan right now running an orphanage. Tom was quite surprised by both of these explanations. She was in college? Oh, wow. I didn't realize you were, Have your parents always had big ideas like that? I think so, answered Daphne. How long have they been away? 3 years. Tom's eyes opened wide, but he couldn't speak with his mouth full. Daphne smirked at him and drank some more orange juice. How have you been with them being away for so long? Well, I do feel kind of... Daphne shrugged. It's fine. Tom could read through the lines on that one. She wasn't fine with it. I'm sure glad you got a hold of your friend, Tom said. It's more dangerous than you can imagine out there. Is the blizzard still going on? asked Daphne, instinctively turning around to look out the windows, but instead saw the curtain still drawn. Tom forced himself not to laugh, but he couldn't keep the smile off his face. "Let me show you something, Daphne," he offered as he made his way to the window next to the fire. He slid the maroon curtains open with one movement to expose the outside view. "Come here," he directed, motioning her towards him with his hand. Daphne frowned, grabbed her crutches, and hobbled over to him. Tom frowned too. He wouldn't have asked her to come if he had remembered she couldn't walk. Daphne stopped next to him and stared out the window. Tom watched her changing countenance as she observed the huge snowflakes falling from the sky. Her dismay increased as she saw the snow on the ground already piling halfway up the window. She moaned softly, looking like she wanted to cry. "Do you know how long the storm is supposed to last?" she asked softly. "Until next Tuesday," Tom informed her. "So I can leave in 5 days," Daphne assumed. Tom tried to sound matter-of-fact when he spoke. "Well, we are expected to get 6 feet of snow by the time the blizzard is over. We won't be able to get out the doorway for at least 3 weeks after that. Maybe longer." Daphne's expression varied from shock to deep disappointment to worry. Her eyes were wide and her mouth slightly open. "How about we sit down before you faint, Daphne?" Tom advised. Daphne agreed rather absent-mindedly. Tom followed her to the cushioned rocking chair a few feet away. He took her crutches and extended a hand to help her sit while she tried to maneuver her injured leg onto the ottoman. Then he sat down on the sofa across from her on the other side of the coffee table. Daphne put both palms on either side of her face. "I have to find a way out. I just have to." She sounded convinced. "You might be able to work on some of your classes online. Is that what you're worried about?" Tom wondered as he settled into the sofa. Daphne let her hands fall. "No, yes, I'm worried about that too, but you're worried about staying with me for that long," Tom assumed. "Well, yes," she confessed. Tom pursed his lips together and glanced over at the fire as he recalled a biting insult from Tanya. "No girl would ever want to live with you in that horrible forsaken place." The memory still stung. He looked back at Daphne, who was looking at him with concern. He cleared his throat. "Come on, I'm not that bad. You liked my food, didn't you?" Daphne raised her arms and started gesturing as she spoke. "Yes, that's just it, all the food," she cried. Then she put a hand up in front of her. "I will pay you back for it all, I promise. I'm going to keep track of everything, room and board, water and power and laundry soap and," she glanced at the fire, "and wood and—" "Whoa, good night," Tom interrupted. "You won't owe me anything, Daphne. It's all free of charge." "I can't let you do that," Daphne exclaimed. "Of course you can. And if you try to pay me back, I won't take a penny." Tom smiled with amusement as he leaned back and put his hands behind his head. Daphne attempted to look stern, which made Tom smile more. "You don't know me very well," she pointed out. "I will pay you back. Besides, your food might be gone by the time I leave." Tom laughed out loud. "Right! That entire waffle you ate is sure to break us." Tom leaned his head back and laughed some more. Daphne looked half flustered, half delighted at his amusement. "Those were really filling!" she exclaimed. Tom couldn't stop chuckling. "You're not an imposition, Daphne. You're probably the easiest guest I've ever had. We could live here for 2 years on the food storage I have." Daphne was staring now with perplexed admiration. "You're so nice. I'm still going to pay you back." Tom leaned forward in earnest. "Consider your good company payment." Daphne took a deep breath but said nothing. Then Tom slapped his thighs. "How about a game of chess, Daphne? I've been dying to have a partner." Daphne raised her eyebrows. "Oh, okay." Tom pulled the game out from the low shelf under the coffee table and set up the pieces quickly. "Ladies first," he announced. Daphne moved a knight. "Oh, starting bold. I like that," Tom said with a smile. Daphne blushed and smiled back shyly. not a cheater, are you? Tom teased as he moved out a knight as well. Daphne shrugged. Only time will tell, she said with a grin. Ah, I bet I can figure it out before you even do it. How about we play a second little game as well? Tell me 3 things about yourself and make one of them a lie. I will try to guess which one it is. Daphne grew thoughtful with a slight look of amusement. Tom was discovering Daphne's face was very expressive, even from moment to moment. Her emotions were easily detected. This was going to be easy. She moved a pawn. All right, I have it. I was named after a Greek goddess, I won first place in a swim meet, and I've been kissed twice. She looked up at him with a brilliant smile on her face. Tom couldn't help but smile back. Did you just dare me to guess if you've been kissed? Daphne's smile broadened. She is tricky. It's like one of those wicked woman traps. He thought for a moment as the 2 of them moved pieces across the chessboard, each occasionally losing one. Are you giving up? Daphne asked with a mischievous grin on her face. Tom smiled a little. No, he countered. It's the first one. The first one isn't true. Daphne raised her eyebrows. You didn't know Daphne was a Greek goddess? I thought that would be the easy one to guess. Tom groaned. No, I didn't know. That one was true? Daphne nodded. Now you have a 50-50 chance. Tom shook his head as he moved his bishop diagonally across the board. No, just tail me. Oh, come on, Tom, she teased. You're the one who wanted to play this game. Tom looked up at her, scrutinizing her expression for a clue. She had a pronounced smirk on her face. Now he knew. Number 3, he guessed. You've been kissed 3 times, haven't you? Daphne looked surprised at his response, but she grinned and shook her head. Really? How many then? Daphne laughed. No, number 2 was the lie. I got 2nd place at the swim meet. Tom threw his head back. Oh, drat. That one was the trick. I was sure it had something to do with the kissing. Daphne laughed some more. Tom pointed a mock scolding finger at her. That is totally cheating. Not at all, she exclaimed, looking delighted. Well then, it's a good thing I just won our chess game. Checkmate, Tom exclaimed as he knocked over Daphne's king. Oh, lands, Daphne cried. How did I not see that? Tom chuckled. You were too distracted with that other little game. So that's how you cheated, Daphne concluded. Not at all, Tom mimicked. They both laughed and then began putting the chess pieces back into the box. You know, I knew you wouldn't be a cheater anyway, Tom said seriously. My pa always taught me how naturally honest and purely good women are. Only women? Daphne asked, raising her eyebrows. Tom shrugged and nodded. More so than men, anyway. Really? That's what he taught you? Daphne questioned, looking curious. Yep, Tom said with one short nod. And I should always treat them that way, or I would be a worse man for it. Daphne put the lid on the chess box and leaned her head back on her headrest and gave him an amusing look. Well, he sounds like a very good man, but I would venture to say you are every bit as good as I am. Tom shook his head at the floor, smiling to himself. If only she knew. I don't think so, Daphne. Really? She insisted, and then she grew earnest. When I was lost, I prayed so hard I would find someone to help me, and here you are, doing everything possible for me. Tom's heart pounded at her deep, sincere gratitude. Daphne, you just solidified my point, he said with a smile. Daphne could not stop blushing when he smiled like that. It was so unfair. He made it worse with his next question. So why don't you tell me about those 2 guys you kissed? I love a good story. Daphne blushed as she rolled her eyes. Not a story I want to share, Tom. Tom gazed at her with a teasing look, but he shrugged and let it go. All right, then. Tell me the story of Daphne, the Greek goddess." Tom shifted so his arm was stretched over the backrest of the sofa. Daphne felt her eyes bulge as she was able to make out the muscles on his chest and arms. She looked at his gorgeous face, smiling at her. This was too much. How was it possible for one man to be so handsome and so sweet? Daphne suddenly realized she was beginning to have feelings for Tom. Just as quickly, she knew he would never reciprocate. Not ever. Guys always fell for beauty, no matter what the other girls had to offer the world. And Daphne definitely was not beautiful. And her life was certainly not like those dumb movies where the girl thinks she's not pretty but is actually super gorgeous. A crushing rush of sadness washed through her at this honest revelation. "Daphne, are you okay?" Tom asked. "Oh, yeah," Daphne blinked. The goddess Daphne was chased by Apollo so aggressively she petitioned the gods to help her. By doing so, they changed her into a laurel tree. Then all Apollo could do was gaze at the beautiful tree and wish in vain. Daphne didn't mention she wished she could change into a laurel tree. Or in other words, she wished she could turn into her friend Laurel, or at least be like her. However, Daphne was not a Greek goddess, so desire was hopeless. "Why did your parents give you that name?" Tom wondered. "Wish I knew the answer, Tom. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me." Tom leaned forward now and rested his forearms on his knees. "What's bothering you, Daphne?" Tom asked softly. She batted a hand at him. "Oh, I'm fine." He didn't look convinced. "I've occasionally been known to have a very open mind, you know," he said, smiling a little. Daphne shook her head. "Is there something I can do to help?" What did Tom want her to say? "Sure, can you make me gorgeous like you?" Oh, this maddening man was so nice to her. The fact Tom even made an effort to talk to her at all while she looked like this was a miracle. Granted, she was the only one to talk to, and that was probably the only reason he was doing it. Daphne was suddenly determined not to give Tom any hint about her feelings for him. Then they could at least have a friendship. "Do you mind if I email my professors?" asked Daphne, desperately wanting a subject change. "Oh, no, of course not," Tom responded, pushing himself off the sofa. "The internet is in my room. The wind really messed with everything this week. I wasn't able to get a connection up and running until just before you woke up this morning. Believe it or not, the satellite connection is better than you can imagine out here." Daphne smiled. "I believe it." Tom held out a hand for Daphne to take. Ridiculously, her heart beat faster as she put her hand in his and stood up on her good leg. Tom leaned over to grab Daphne's crutches that were lying on the floor and handed them to her. "Thank you," said Daphne. "You're very thoughtful, you know that?" "And your gratitude is like a breath of fresh air, Daphne." Daphne blushed deeply at his compliment, and then beat herself up about it as she followed Tom past the kitchen and into a bedroom a few steps farther. This bedroom was much smaller than the one she had slept in last night. It had a single bed covered with a dark blue comforter against the wall on the right-hand side. A wooden computer desk stood directly beside the bed, with a bay window behind the desk. On the opposite wall, there was a tall closet with closed wooden doors. Daphne started noticing a stylistic theme throughout the cabin. Almost all the furniture was either oak or pine. Daphne liked the simple beauty very much. Before Daphne was done admiring her surroundings, Tom was already sitting in the desk chair, checking some of his own messages online. She stopped when she saw his hand covering his mouth. "What is it?" asked Daphne. "More bad weather?" Tom didn't move, so Daphne thumped her way toward him so she was standing beside him. Now she noticed his chest was moving up and down with deep breathing, and he was shaking his head slowly with an expression of utter dismay as he stared at the computer screen. "I can't. Please, no," he whispered. "Tom?" Daphne whispered in return. "What happened?" Abruptly, Tom stood up, causing his chair to tip over backward as he briskly walked out of the room. "What on earth?" Daphne slowly thumped her way with her crutches out of the bedroom. She spotted Tom facing the window, his hands pressed against the glass with his arms stretched out and his head bowed low. "Tom?" Daphne called cautiously to him. "I need a minute, Daphne," he said rather curtly. "Oh, okay," Daphne stammered. She clumsily turned around and clunked down the hall to her bedroom. She plopped down on her bed, wondering what could possibly have happened to turn Tom's world upside down in only a matter of seconds. She didn't dare leave her room. Then, just as she thought she might die of boredom, Tom opened her bedroom door. She noticed his eyes were red and a bit puffy, but other than that, he looked calm. "My pa was killed," he choked out. "What?" asked Daphne, shocked. "A drunk driver on ice," he explained. Daphne inhaled a slow, silent breath. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Tom," she said softly. "The viewing is tonight. I'll have to leave soon," Tom sniffed. He pursed his lips and inhaled a shaky breath. Daphne knew he was trying to hold back a sob. The whole thing was so heartbreaking. She thought of reminding him it wasn't safe to travel, but she knew if she were in his shoes, she would go anyway. "Why don't you come sit down for a minute?" Daphne suggested, patting the bed next to her. Tom shook his head. "No, thank you." He inhaled another forced breath. "I know you want to get out of here, Daphne, but it wouldn't be safe to take you with me, especially since you can't walk well. My snowmobile has a good chance of getting stuck out there." Tom rubbed his eyes with his arm. "I promise I'll come back in 2 weeks when the storm has cleared and take you home. I'll show you where I keep all the food storage before I go. Do you think you'll be all right?" "Don't worry about me, Tom," Daphne insisted. "Let's get you out of here before the storm gets worse." Tom nodded, but did nothing except step back and lean against the wall. He stared at the ceiling in silence. Poor Tom. What a good man he was. He had rescued her from a deserted wilderness and life-threatening temperatures. He had fed her, clothed her, sheltered her, and top of that, he was kind to her, and looked her in the eye without flinching. Yes, she owed Tom big time. Now he was the one in need, and she had no idea how to help him. I will go pack you some food for the trip, so you can get your other things together," she said. Tom glanced at her with a weak smile. "Thanks, Daphne." Daphne smiled a little in return. "Of course," she said. "I'm so sorry this happened." Tom stared back with a tortured look in his eyes. And that concludes Chapter 3. I hope you liked it. I hope you come back next week for Chapter 4, which is called Facing the Music. We get to find out a lot more about Tom in the next chapter, so stay tuned. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.